really glad to have you here. So, evolution fascinates most of us, but we don't really have the correct information about it. And we tend to assume a lot of things that often lead us in the wrong direction, and we end up being confused. I mean, at least that's the part for me. So, that was actually. So today we have Dr. Supreet here from IIT Bombay again, who's going to help us get deeper insights into this wonderful science. And so talking about Dr. Supreet, he's done his BTech from chemical engineering from IIT Delhi in 2005, and he pursued his MS and PhD from University of Illinois. And he's been assistant professor in chemical engineering at IIT Gandhinagar till 2012. And currently he's a professor in the Department of Chemical Engineering at IIT Bombay. His research interests include studying evolutionary forces shaping the processes of adaptation and speciation. And he's an intermediate fellow, DBT Wellcome Trust India Alliance, and a young associate of the Indian National Academy of Engineers. So today in this discussion, we'll take a tour of developments in evolutionary thought from Darwin, mid-19th century, to some of the open problems of interest today. So without further ado, I would request Dr. Supreet to please begin the talk today. Please, sir.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Sakshi. It's a pleasure, actually. I love to chat about evolution, and today is no different. I think it would really help if those of you who do not have bandwidth issues, if you could just switch on cameras. I feel like I'm talking to a wall. Sadly, that's what it is like these days. And if you can, that will be great. If you are shy, there is no pressure. So if you can do that, otherwise it's all right. Okay, so thanks. At least 1% did it. Thanks, Yash. Great. We have a few more converts. Cool. So before we start, can you tell me a little bit about yourselves? Of course, I have known Sakshi for a little over 6 months now. But if you just tell me about your educational background and how long are we supposed to go, Sakshi? Is that like an hour or so?
Yeah, an hour.
Sure, great. So is the general background of the people that we have here is pharmacy? Am I correct in assuming that?
Yeah, we also have students from pure science background, different institutes like ICERs and IITs also. Okay. But yeah, our student chapter is basically from pharmacy background. So yeah.
Cool. All right, cool. So I mean, you know, I'm a chemical engineer by training. You guys are in pharmacy, close enough. And at some point when I went to graduate school in the US, I sort of found problems in biology much more interesting in engineering. So I made the switch to microbiology, and my thesis work was on studying pathogens and their gene regulation. And I worked on a particular pathogen. And since I came back to India, I sort of became interested in questions of evolution. And what I'm really interested in now is that's what my group works on, is how do new species form. And we try and understand this process experimentally, that starting from a group of individuals, which is one species, what would the environmental conditions need to be such that this group of individuals, which are all one species, can split into two, such that we have two distinct group of species. Such an event is called speciation event in literature. And understanding these events was, and a process like speciation was referred to by Darwin as the mystery of mysteries in evolution. And after more than 150 years of evolutionary study, speciation, many aspects of speciation still remain a mystery. So what I thought I'll talk about, I mean, of course, I have not had formal training in evolution, which I think has been good and bad, because what that has meant is that I have been forced to learn things of my own. And I've been doing that for the last 10 years. 2012 is when I started. It's been 10 years. I've had a great time doing that. And I think one of the most fun things that I've been doing and that I've had doing studying evolution is sort of studying the history of the subject and how did we arrive at where we are today. So for the purpose of today, I thought what I'll do is I'll touch on two different questions. Uh, but if time permits, I would rather do one well than to rush through both of them. So we'll go through this and we'll basically cover a story and we'll understand how did theory of natural selection come up and what does it actually mean in terms of voting. Before we just a couple of things. One is if you have something to say, just feel free to interrupt me anytime. I'm happy to take questions, comments, anything at any time when I'm talking. And the second is, can anybody tell me an implication, an evolutionary process that we see happening around us?
Mosquito resistance to like mosquito poison.
Correct. Okay. Mosquito resistance to what?
Mosquito repellents.
Yeah, sure. So any sort of insecticide that we will use. Antibiotic resistance is another such example, right, for bacteria. Any other example of evolution happening right before us?
Yeah, may I?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, I guess we could relate to our present situation where same COVID-19 virus is evolving really fast into various strains.
Absolutely, right? We hear about this Delta strain and new mutants coming up all the time. That's actually evolution playing evolution in action right in front of us. So when an evolutionary process takes place, like the COVID variants coming up, what do you think are the what do you think are the relevant factors in determining how fast does a species evolve? So we're talking about viral evolution here. So what do you think are the relevant factors which dictate how fast a species can evolve?
Maybe the ability of organism to handle mutations within its genome and still survive.
Yeah. No, that's true. And what you're saying is a property that is usually called robustness in the field of evolution literature. That the organism should be robust in the sense that it acquires mutation and should still be functional. Correct. What else?
I guess the time of cell division.
Absolutely, absolutely. So a very important feature in an evolutionary process is the generation time. How many, given a certain amount of time, how many generations can this organism go through within this specified period of time? And that's important because the more generations you go through, the more chance of acquisition of mutations. So that's why viruses, because their generation times are so small and they grow to such large numbers, the chances that you have a variant there which is better at causing infection than the one already existing, the chances of coming up a variant like that are actually really high. So yeah, generation time. I mean, if you think of a human species, I mean, biologically, we need 15, 20 years to reach sexual maturity, and then we procreate. So the generation time is 20 years. Evolution is going to be fairly slow, but that's not. But that's where the generation time becomes a relevant factor. Cool. Okay. So we all agree that there are a few examples of great import which are happening around us and which are evolutionary processes. So I thought we'll talk about these two stories that are there on this slide, but if time permits, we can only talk about the first one. And I love this. It's a really cool story about what had happened in the middle of 19th century. So, all right. So our story involves these three characters: Charles Darwin, Alfred Russel Wallace, and a Scotsman called Patrick Matthew. Of course, we've all heard of Darwin. Has anybody heard of Alfred Wallace?
Yeah, I've heard of him.
Okay. And in what context?
It was in an analogy like Darwin studied on Galapagos Island and Alfred Wallace conducted his study on Malay Archipelago.
Correct. Yeah. Perfect. Great. Patrick Matthew, has anybody heard of him?
No, he's new to me.
Yeah. Patrick Matthew is sort of a forgotten figure in the history of evolutionary studies. Anyway, so these are the characters that we'll be talking about. Okay. So our sort of story starts with these Wallace and Bates, Henry Bates. And these two guys were in South America and they were collecting samples. They had gone there together collecting samples. And the middle of 19th century science, the history of the scientists involved, all men, is of a nature where it's a pastime of the rich. But Wallace was an exception. His sort of he was dependent on his collections being taken by curators, private curators or museums, and then make money to be able to sustain his scientific adventures. And both these guys they know each other. They go together to South America, but within a year of going there, they sort of part ways and go their different ways. Bates stayed along the coast of South America, whereas Wallace went inland, again collecting samples, and he had collected tens of thousands of species and characterized them. And so Bates remains there, but Wallace, this should be 1852 in the third bullet here, not 1952, obviously. So 1952, Wallace is returning to England.
Sorry to barge in, sir. Are you changing the slides? Because we can't really see.
I am changing the slide. I'm on the Alfred Russel Wallace and Henry Bates slide. Can you guys not see?
It's visible, sir.
So it's visible.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. I'm sorry.
No problem. All right. So Wallace is returning. He sort of had enough of the adventure, and when he's coming back to England, what happens is that his ship catches fire in the Atlantic, and all the specimens that he has stored in the crates in the ship are lost, and he's on the sea in a lifeboat for a few days before he's rescued along with some other companions by a ship passing by. And eventually he comes back to 1952, having lost a majority of his work of the last 4 years. And he sort of sets foot on land in 1852. And the one decision that he makes is that he's never going to sail again, because this has been a traumatic experience. And he's been lucky to actually still be alive. But from the context that we are interested in is that the question that these two guys were interested in asking was that where do new species come from? And that was the larger context in which these two were working. Can anybody guess that after having taken a vow, what to do, what not to do is go sailing again in 1952 and 1852? What does Wallace do next? And as somebody, I think it was Yash, pointed out, that of course he goes back to sea again, and the next leg of the adventure in his life takes him to the Malay archipelago, which is present-day Indonesia and Malaysia. All right, we'll come to that part a little bit later. In the meantime, much before them, Darwin has actually taken a voyage on the ship called Beagle. And Darwin was born in 1809, and usually the picture of Darwin that's shown is the one where he's this old man. But he was young at the time. He was 22, and after much resistance from his family regarding a ship journey around the world, he finally managed to get a place as the sort of the dining mate of the captain of the ship, a young man called Fitzroy, a naturalist on the ship, who was just going to be interested in collecting specimens and understanding life forms as they pass. And the current thinking when Darwin takes this voyage is that all creatures were created in the way, shape, and form that they are manifested on Earth by a supreme deity, and they were placed on Earth just like that. And in this hierarchy of living beings that exist on the planet, human beings occupy the top tier. They are as close to perfection as living entities have come. And that view gets challenged. So there is this, the prevalent view at the time is that living entities are immutable and they do not change with time. And that view gets challenged by a number of observations and readings. One of the readings that Darwin took with himself was a book on geology by his mentor, who comes into a story a little bit later. Anyway, so 1831, they take off and the ship spends about the next 2.5 to 3 years along the east coast of South America. And they're just crisscrossing and taking latitudinal and longitudinal measurements along the east coast. That was one of the mandates of the Beagle that Darwin was on. So many of these places, Darwin would actually step off of the ship, go inland to study many species, and then join the ship at a later date at a predetermined place and location, place and time. Anyway, so after taking this whole bunch of measurements, the ship, you have to wait for the summer to cross the tip of the South American continent. And when it was summer in the southern hemisphere, the ship crosses. And one of the curious interactions of Darwin is the tribes that he meets at the islands which are situated just at the tip of South America. And these are tribes that have not been in contact with the civilized society of the West, of English West, for a very long time. And to Darwin, a question begins to form when he's asking that the people that he's looking at it did not seem to him that they were the pinnacle of creation. And so he begins to question that it doesn't reason right that human beings are this pinnacle of all living entities that live on Earth. Anyway, so the journey continues, takes him to famously what are the Galapagos Islands, and these are a whole bunch of islands which are off the coast of Ecuador here, on the mainland, and of course, when Darwin gets there, the islands are wild, and the plantation there is very severe and harsh, lot of cactus. It's not pretty at all. And in fact, Darwin in his notebooks records that if hell had any gardens, this would be what it would be like. But a couple of interesting thing happens there. The locals on the island tell him that by looking at the design on the back of the tortoise that are floating in the waters there, they can tell that which island has this tortoise come from. So there were subtle differences that locals could identify and tell that where had this particular tortoise come from. And in addition is the famous work on the birds there, that depending on the exact ecology on each of these islands, the birds there had slightly different phenotypic variations, particularly beak size. And Darwin was able to identify that. Although he doesn't make the connection at the time, but one of the things that we know from Darwin's journey is that he's a meticulous note keeper, and everything is recorded and stored in a very pristine way. So again, I mean, the central question that is forming in his head is that it seems that species are changing with time. And he also recognizes that it's the same phenomenology that is taking place in geology, where small changes are taking place over a very long period of time, and put together, this creates a huge change when we look at a elongated time, elongated period. So geological change can take place fairly slowly over a long duration, and so can biological change, is what it seems to Darwin. And of course, there are a lot of observations that Darwin makes in the interior of the South American peninsula. The rest of the journey was fairly fast in the sense that they didn't stay at one place for very long. But there is a lot of sort of observations that we know of Darwin made along these, and time forbids to get into the details of those. But there are some excellent biographies of Darwin which are available, and I think you guys. Anyway, so the journey was initially supposed to last less than a year, but it took 5. And after 5 years on sea, when Darwin comes back, he's been sending samples from all across the world back to England. And by the time he gets back, Darwin is a celebrity among naturalists. He's been the one who's traveled the world, has seen lots of things that others haven't. And he's one of the celebrated naturalists in all of Europe. And soon after coming here, Darwin privately notes in his evolution, he kept a series of notebooks which are called transmutation notebooks. And in one of them in 1837, which is 1 year after the journey, is this sort of this iconic image that you will see a lot if you're a student of evolution. And on this page in this notebook, Darwin's trying to understand how species have come about in nature. And what he's imagining is that it seems that species are not mutable, not immutable, but in fact, species change with time. And one of the evidence that he sees for this across this entire 5-year journey is that similar looking species would exist in the same place at the same time. That could be me looking at 2 closely related species existing today, or when I'm studying the fossil record, could be 2 closely related species which existed however many million years back. So there was this co-inhabitance of similar looking species at a particular location across the world. So it seemed as if there were these minor changes taking place. Species weren't randomly spread. There was some logic to it. And for the easiest way that comes to Darwin to explaining the spread of species is through this tree-like distribution, that there was a central node from which diversification took place, and there is this node which split into 2 species, and so on and so forth. So Darwin's, as early as 1837, it's taking shape in his mind that species are diverging, and they have a common, 2 species would have a common ancestor, and divergence would lead to formation of 2 different species. And that's how life diversity is generated. And it's really cool that he was able to do that less than a year after his trip. But also that in his notebook, he notes that I think, he's churning all the evidence that he's seen for the last 5 years. And this seems like a possible explanation for what he's seen in the last half a decade. However, that's private. Transmutation notebooks were not made accessible to anybody. In fact, he was very secretive about them. More publicly, it took him 3 years to write a comprehensive account of what had happened in the 5 years, and he's a celebrity now. So he publishes The Voyage of the Beagle, and he documents all the observations and stuff like that. But on evolution, which is not an idea which was never proposed before, the idea was there. Lamarck wrote his famous book in 1809, the year. But when he's writing his accounts of The Voyage of the Beagle, on evolution, Darwin sort of sidesteps the issue. He doesn't want to get into the business of evolution. He's just reporting what he saw. And on evolution, he says that it is clear that several islands have each their peculiar species. He's talking about the Galapagos. Of the same genre, when these are placed together, they have a wide range of character. But there is not space in this work to enter on this curious subject. So he's talking about finches at the Galapagos, and he says that minor variations exist. And if you were to line all these birds up, you would see that a lot of change exists in these species on the islands, and it definitely means something. But he doesn't want to enter into this discussion in this particular text. And it is this which sort of Wallace reads, and he thinks that, oh, if he doesn't really understand, doesn't want to get into it, then we don't really understand how species come into being. And that is what had prompted him to enter into this and go to South America with Bates, collecting samples. However, as we saw, that this is 1839, but in 1837, Darwin was formulating his views of evolution. He had something in mind. But there are several reasons why he doesn't public, and the primary one is that Darwin doesn't really want to present an account of evolution which is going to be a flimsy account. He has a lot of evidence. He has thought about the subject a lot. One of the things that Darwin loved to do, which is going to become relevant in our story later on, is that he was always talking to breeders, and he would send them questionnaires. These could be animal breeders, these could be plant breeders, pigeon breeders, and he would send them questionnaire as to what do you do, how do you select two individuals to mate of your plants, how do you cross two particular varieties of the same species, and so on and so forth. So he had a lot of evidence from these responses, from his studies, from his conversations and his thought, and he didn't want to present a flimsy argument when it came to proposing evolution. He knew that he was proposing something radical, and he wanted it to be a most comprehensive account with all evidence put together when he was proposing the theory of natural selection. And he just wasn't ready. He knew that it was going to be a text which runs into 2,000 to 3,000 pages, and he's not yet, and he doesn't want to expose himself to attack, because this is going to question the authority of the church and is going to invite ridicule. So he doesn't want to do it just yet. Anyways, sidesteps the issue. All right. In the meantime, Wallace goes back to sea the very next year that he survived the trip from South America to England, and this time he's chosen to go to these bunch of islands between Australia and Asia. And in this trip now, he's sort of hopping around these islands, and he's just doing some inexhaustible amount of work and collecting and classifying species over several years. And while he's doing that, a theory begins to take shape in his mind. And one of the things that happens is that he notices that the picture on the right is not very clear. But if you look at this map, one of the things he notices is that among these islands, there is a line that you can draw, and everything to the southeast of that line, every island to the southeast of that line has marsupials, kangaroos, which are found on these islands. But everything to the northwest of that line doesn't have the marsupials, has monkeys. And he also saw similar type of separation that Darwin saw with finches. Wallace sees it with butterflies on these different islands. So there's a lot of similarities in the journeys that the two people make here. And while this is going on, a theory begins to take place in Wallace's mind. And he's been sent on this trip to collect specimens and send them back to his benefactors back in England. And his job is not really to come up with a theoretical advance. He's just been asked to collect samples and send them back. And sort of in honor of the fact that Wallace came up with this line which saw this segregation, that line is called the Wallace line. That's what I tried to show here, but it's not very clear here. So in the meantime, both Wallace and Darwin read an essay that was published first in 1798 by an economist, Thomas Malthus. And Malthus is talking about human population. And what he's arguing is that as we bring greater amount of area under agriculture, the amount of food production that's taking place is increasing linearly over time. However, population growth is taking place exponentially. So there will come a point, if this trend continues of food production increasing linearly, but demand or population increasing exponentially, there will soon come a point when the exponential growth is going to outstrip the linear supply. And hence there will be a conflict. And in this conflict, now you can't feed all the individuals that exist in the population, and hence only the fittest that exist in the population are going to survive and the rest are going to perish. And both Wallace and Darwin read this essay by Malthus around the same time. And this really was the final argument, final nudge that they needed in order to come up with the theory of natural selection. I'll skip the industrialization versus specialization part here. It's not really relevant. Anyway, so in a couple of years since Wallace has been there, he writes a paper and he calls the paper on the law which has regulated introduction of new species, and that being the central premise since his South American days, that how do newer species come into being. And in this paper that Darwin sends back to his benefactors and also people of eminent people in science in Europe, what he says is that every species has come into existence coincident both in space and time with a pre-existing closely allied species. So what he's saying is that species distribution is not random. Closely allied species like each other, they have come into existence together in both space and time, which was exactly what Darwin had noted when he was doing his studies in South America. And Wallace goes next to say that the best mode of representing the natural arrangement of species is a branching tree. So he also recognizes that species are not spread randomly, but there is logic to it, which means that species are changing with time. And the best mode to represent this changing scenario is this branching tree, which is, I mean, of course, it's unknown to him, but 18 years ago, Darwin had drawn that branching tree in his notebook. When he sends this paper back to Europe, sort of the reaction in Europe is not very favorable, and he's told to continue the task that he's been sent out there to do and not focus too much on theorizing about evolution. So Wallace continues. Wallace writes next, this continues for a few more years, and in 1858, Wallace writes a letter to Darwin. And in this letter to Darwin, and the letter is more like a chapter, it's about 40 pages. And in the letter, he says that I have come to a viewpoint which I think might explain how species have come into being. And I would like you to go through this accompanying pages along with this letter and tell me what you think about this. Along with this, he says that he would really appreciate it if Darwin can share the letter with the geologist Charles Lyell, who was also Darwin's mentor from his early days. And he seeks Darwin's opinion because Darwin is well known throughout Europe, both England and continental Europe. And in this note, Wallace says that the life of wild animals is a struggle for existence and to provide for an infant offspring. So he recognizes that there is a struggle for existence, which is coming out of Malthus's argument. And the life is to provide for an infant offspring, because any individual which does not provide or which does not bear an offspring is an evolutionary dead end, and hence that's what the struggle for existence is about. And he says that perhaps all of variation must have some definite effect, however slight, in the habits and capacities of the individuals. a variety having slightly increased powers must inevitably in time acquire a superiority in numbers. And what he's saying is that in this population which is competing for survival and reproduction, there is variation that exists between these individuals. And in this pool of variants that exist, not all variants are equally well adapted to survive and reproduce in this environment. Some are slightly better placed to reproduce and survive, and some are at a disadvantage in terms of doing that. And in this way, the ones which are placed at an advantage will do better than the others and displace the others. And over geological time, this is going to lead to large-scale evolutionary changes. It's been a long time since Darwin has been working on his book. So, I mean, he came back from the Beagle in 1836. So it's been 22 years since he's completed the journey. And in the meantime, he's got sidetracked into a lot of other projects. So it's not as if he was working exclusively on the book. But Darwin was putting together what he thought would be his magnus opus. In fact, in the middle of 1840s, Darwin had written an abstract, a short abstract of about 50 pages, which basically contained the concise précis of what his thoughts were on evolution and how he thought evolution took place. Darwin was not a very healthy man. He had a lot of health issues throughout his life. And in fact, in that time, he was afraid that he might not live long enough to be able to write his book. And one of the things he did was he requested his wife, Emma Wedgwood, to make sure that the letter reaches the right people. I mean, the chapter that reaches the right people in case he does not survive his illness. And in a few years' time, that few dozen pages had expanded to 200 pages. So Darwin was continuously working through this, but all of this in private, and he didn't really share it with anybody other than a couple of people that we'll talk about. So he's working on this, and if we compare this with the notes that Darwin had at the time, it's quite remarkable that the language that the two men are using here is almost identical. Wallace says the life of wild animals is struggle for existence and to provide for infant offspring. That bearing on natural selection, all nature is at war. The struggle very often falls on the egg and the seed or on the seedling. Right? They're talking about the same thing, and these are the lessons that they derived from Malthus's essay. Wallace here is talking about variations. Darwin in his draft says any variation, however infinitely slight, if it did promote during any part of the life, even in the slightest degree, the welfare of the being, such variation would tend to be preserved or selected, and hence natural selection. Any variation that helps you propagate better, faster, is going to get selected by nature, and any variation that places you at a disadvantage is going to be weeded out in the process of evolution. So they're practically using the entire, they're practically using the exact words, let alone exact arguments. All right. Okay. So let me ask you guys, what do you guys think Darwin did when he reads this letter? What would be a natural reaction? Anybody except Sakshi?
Yeah, I guess somebody wants to say.
Surprised.
I'm sorry, say that again. I'm sorry, can you say that again, please?
Probably he would have wanted to publish his own work as soon as possible.
Yeah. Yeah. Anybody else? I mean, what would be an emotional reaction of a man who had spent the best part of 3 decades working on something to be sent a note like this?
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah.
Yeah. First of all, he would be a bit, not a bit, very surprised. Like
Mm-hmm.
someone has exactly found out what he is thinking of, and he would also think that his entire findings are at a stake. Like
Mm-hmm.
someone could take a credit of exactly the thing he deduced, like working 3 decades on that.
Yes. 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 Absolutely. I mean, this. I mean, to any. I mean, a natural reaction to something like this is going to be a massive disappointment and fear. Uh, but Wallace has also not just shared the letter with him. He's also placed a request to Darwin to share the letter with Charles Lyell and seek his opinion too. So what Darwin does is sort of share the letter that Wallace has written with two men who at this point have been aware of what Darwin has been thinking for a long time now. I mean, this is now 58. So Darwin has shared his thoughts with these two people, and one of them is the geologist Charles Lyell, and the other one is a botanist who in the last 15 years or so was a massive help to Darwin. His name was Joseph Hooker. So Darwin shares the letter with Lyell and Hooker, and he basically says that, what do I do now? This guy has come up with at the almost the identical solution to this problem. It would not be ethical for me to regret of having arrived at this. And Darwin recognizes that this is not a very trivial thing. This is not a small result that they're talking about. So he seeks the inputs of these two people that he trusts, and he also shares the letter that Wallace has written to him with Lyell and Hooker, and a compromise is reached. And what those two propose is that there is a meeting which is to be held soon thereafter. Uh, and the meeting is the Linnean Society meeting. And in this meeting, the proposal is that both Darwin and Wallace will submit their papers presenting their findings. Both their papers will be read at this meeting. So the proposal of theory of natural selection is going to be jointly done by these two people on the same day. So no one robs the other of the credit of having arrived at the theory of natural selection. And both Darwin and Wallace agree to the proposed solution, and that is what happened. And let me just read you. There's a lot of text, but it's interesting. So this is text from the letter that Charles Lyell and Joseph Hooker wrote to the Linnean Society, requesting them to host the papers by Darwin and Wallace. And what they write, I think it's worthwhile going through some of the text. They write is that, my dear sir, the accompanying papers which we have the honor of commuting to the Linnean Society and which all relate to the same subject, that is the laws which affect the production of varieties, races, and species, contain the investigations of two indefatigable naturalists, Darwin and Wallace. These gentlemen having, independently and unknown to one another, conceived the same very ingenious theory to account for the appearance and perpetuation of varieties and of the specific forms on our planet, may both fairly claim the merit for being original thinkers in this important line of inquiry. But neither of them having published his views, though Mr. Darwin has for many years past been repeatedly urged by us to do so, and both authors having now unreserved in our hands, we think it would best promote the interests of science that a selection from them should be laid before the Linnean Society. And this is what happened. However, when the day for presentations came, neither Darwin nor Wallace was actually there to read the papers. The papers were read by someone else on their behalf. Wallace was, of course, not even in Europe, and Darwin was at the time mourning loss of a child who had just died. So their papers are read. They're submitted to the Linnean Society. Linnean Society is, of course, named after Linnaeus, the great classifier who sort of gave us one of the first arrangements, one of the first ways of arrangement of life in a tree format. The society is in England and not his native Sweden. But surprisingly, these papers were read, and of course, this was thought to be a big deal. But sort of the result went ignored, and no one really paid any attention to this proposal. And the society president, in summarizing that year's meeting, the 1858 meeting, wrote that nothing of significance was reported in this year's meeting. So there was no huge result or anything like that happened in that year. All right, let me skip this. And this sort of forced Darwin's hand. He knew he got lucky one time around, and Wallace was very gracious in being invited to share the stage with Darwin here. Wallace was always recognizing of the fact that Darwin had arrived at the theory of natural selection well before Wallace had. And he was very happy to accept it. But Darwin knew that he got lucky this time. He may not get another chance. So the very next year, 1859, is when Origin of Species was published. And this was because he stepped on it and made sure that the first draft was ready as soon as he possibly could. And one of the things that happened because of this was that what Darwin had conceived would be a book a few thousand pages long was condensed to about 500 pages, which was published as the first edition of Origin of Species in 1859. In fact, that is the reason that the full title of the book is an abstract on blah blah blah. So Darwin calls it an abstract because he knows that he's not doing it in the detail that he could do, but he has to do it because of what has just happened. All right. Our story has, of course, this is the 1250 copies printed, all sold on first day. And while there was resistance to the idea of natural selection from the church and some other civil society quarters, scientifically, the book didn't meet with any great resistance. Darwin has actually chapters. I mean, I strongly encourage you to read Origin of Species, first version, first edition, if possible, first edition, if possible, because it's a beautiful argument. Darwin wants to convince the reader. Darwin, in fact, wants to place the reader in a place where there is no way that the reader can contest the existence of theory of natural selection. So he starts off by talking about experiments that breeders do, the varieties that exist, and how species are not immutable, but you can actually change them, and gardeners do it and breeders do it, and slowly takes you step by step, almost holding your hand to the theory of natural selection. He also has chapters on limitations of theory of natural selection. And he recognizes that he doesn't understand many of these things. For example, one of the big conundrum was that he didn't know mechanism. He didn't know how a parent's trait gets passed on to the next generation. And of course, Mendel, a few years after that, made a big step in answering that question, but Darwin was not aware of that. So there are many holes, and he knows that there are many holes. And some of the later editions have additions in him trying to sort of plug these holes. But Darwin was wrong about a lot of things in terms of proposing mechanisms as to how this proceeds. He proposed something in one of the later editions. He proposed something called pangenesis, which was just an absurd idea. But it's a very easy read. Darwin's prose is very, very readable, and I would strongly encourage you to read if you're interested. Anyway, our story has one slight twist. Remember Patrick Matthew, the third player in our story? After having read Origin of Species, he writes a letter. Patrick Matthew, a Scotsman, he writes a letter to a magazine called Gardener's Chronicle and Agricultural Gazette. And this magazine was something that Darwin had subscribed to through his life because he was always interested in breeding, and agriculture is one place where breeding happens. And in the April 1860 issue, Patrick Matthew writes to the editors, a letter to the editor, and he says that in your number of March, I observe a long quotation from the Times stating that Mr. Darwin, quote, professes to have discovered the existence and modus operandi of the natural law of selection, that is, the power in nature which takes the place of man and performs a selection in organic life. This discovery, recently published as the results of 20 years investigation and reflection by Mr. Darwin, turns out to be what I published very fully and brought to apply practically to forestry in my work, Naval Timber and Arboriculture, published as far back as 1831 by so-and-so. So, and then he writes, and then he copies text from his 1831 book, and he says that the following is an extract from my book from 1831, which clearly proves that I was the one who arrived at the theory of natural selection before Darwin did. So, I mean, it's a huge claim that Patrick Matthew is making there. And just to give you a bit of background, Patrick Matthew was a Scotsman. He had a large farm where he grew trees. And one of the things that he was convinced about was that in order for Britain to maintain her global domination, it would need a very strong naval fleet. And in order to have a naval fleet, you needed the best kind of wood that you could possibly have. So his 1831 book is called on Naval Timber and Arboriculture, which is the science of growing trees. He's talking about how can we systematically experiment to come up with wood which is better suited for naval purposes. That is the premise of the book. And in the appendix of the book, he's writing about the principle which will guide in coming up with better wood for naval fleets. And that principle is what Darwin is calling the theory of natural selection. And Patrick Matthew has just discovered it 3 decades before Darwin wrote his book, almost 3 decades. It's a short book on naval timber and arboriculture. You can find it easily. It's not a very difficult read. The appendix is very short. Again, if you guys are interested. So Darwin subscribes to this book, to this magazine. And of course, when this is published in 1860, he reads this letter. And having read this letter, he obviously will go back and read the book. And he reads the book. It's a very short book, as I said. And he reads the book, and in the next month's issue, he writes a letter to the magazine editor, a reply to Matthew. And Darwin writes that I have been much interested by Mr. Patrick Matthew's communication in the number of your paper dated so and so. I freely acknowledge that Mr. Matthew has anticipated by many years which I have offered to the origin of species under the name of natural selection. So he concedes. I think that no one will feel surprised that neither I nor apparently any other naturalist had heard of Mr. Matthews's view, considering how briefly they are given and that they appear in the appendix to a work on naval timber and arboriculture. I can do no more than offer my apologies to Mr. Matthew for my entire ignorance of his publication. If another edition of my work is called for, I will insert a notice to the foregoing effect. And that is indeed what happens. Third edition onwards of The Origin of Species, there were 6 in Darwin's life. Third edition onwards, Darwin added a section which is prior theories regarding evolution, and he gives credit to Patrick Matthew for his 1831 book. Matthew wrote one more letter in reply to this, and Matthew is irked by the fact that Darwin is being given credit because apparently he has collected so much volume. That is why Darwin is being given credit. So he writes one more letter to the editor explaining why he didn't feel the need to collect that much evidence when he was proposing his version of the theory of natural selection. And Matthew writes, to me, the conception of this law of nature came intuitively as a self-evident fact, almost without an effort of concentrated thought. Mr. Darwin here seems to have more merit in the discovery than I have had, because to me, it did not appear a discovery. I mean, Matthew says this was obvious. There was no discovery here. Darwin seems to have worked it out by inductive reason, slowly and with due caution, to have made his way synthetically from fact to fact onwards, which is how he has arranged Origin of Species. While with me, it was by a general glance at the scheme of nature that I estimated this select production of species as an a priori recognizable fact, an axiom requiring only to be pointed out to be admitted by unprejudiced minds of sufficient grasp. So Matthew says, look, this was obvious. That's why I did not do it. Darwin says evidence, but this is so obvious that you didn't really need evidence. But not only did Matthew not get any credit, he seems to be a name which has been sort of forgotten in the history of evolutionary thought. Not many texts mention him. In fact, Matthew was sort of but by this time, Matthew is also Darwin's senior by many, many years. So Matthew is very old by this time. And in fact, he was so disappointed that he also printed cards which under his name said Patrick Matthew, discoverer of the law of species. So that's sort of the story that we wanted to talk about. What we'll do now, so natural selection has 3 components. Natural selection rests on 3 pillars. The first one is that you need, in a place, you need variation, right? Variants must exist. If these variants exist, variants which are relevant in the sense that they have different reproductive capacities. If you have variations, then these variants will reproduce according to their reproductive capacities, and that's how the next generation is going to be. More than that, this variation is also linked with the chances of survival, perhaps. So you could have one particular variant which gives you 1 offspring, the other variant gives you 2 offsprings before the parents themselves die. Moreover, this variation should be heritable, such that the offspring of the parent which only gave 1 offspring should also give only 1 offspring, and the offspring of the parent which give 2 offsprings would then in each would then eat 2 more offsprings. If variation exists, if variation has different fitness, and if this variation is heritable, if these 3 tenets are observed, and then this gives us room to this gives room for natural selection to come into picture and evolutionary change to take place. So I'm almost all of time. I thought I could do, that was very ambitious. I thought I could do 2 stories, but we'll only do 1. But I'm happy to stick around and take a few questions if you guys have any. But thanks for being very patient.
Thank you, Dr. Supreet. It was a wonderful talk, and it was a pleasure to listen to the story again. And we actually have a few questions from the registrants that we had asked in the beginning only. So I would request Yash to please ask them up, and then we can ask the audience. They can unmute and ask if they have any questions.
Yes, I can't hear you.
Hello, am I audible?
I can hear you now. Yeah.
Yes, so I'll be reading the questions which were sent to us right in the registration form. So the first question is, are we still evolving, and can the effects of evolution and the technological progress that we have made clash in the future?
We're definitely evolving. We're definitely evolving. I'm assuming that the questioner by we means human beings. We're absolutely evolving, but at least to me, what is not clear is what are the selective forces which are shaping our evolution now, when we have almost created this world where the outside natural conditions do not matter, and we are evolving in this environment, in this artificial environment that we have created for ourselves. There is a concept in evolutionary biology called fitness, and fitness in context of human population can be thought of as the number of progenies that you leave behind before you die. So I mean, if I don't leave any progeny behind before I die, that I'm an evolutionary doesn't matter as far as evolution is concerned. So it really depends on what is the selection pressure, which is not clear in my head, that in this artificial environment, an artificial world that we have created, where natural forces sort of have very little effect on us, what are the selection pressures? And I don't see, I mean, there being a conflict between technology and evolution. I think technology is going to shape in which direction evolution takes place. Evolution is a process which is evolution is blind, they say, and what that means is that tomorrow, if we take a step in this particular direction as a species, that does not mean that it's going to be helpful to us in another 500 generations. Evolution is going to select for what is being selected for immediately. Yeah, so I mean, I'm not really sure, but I don't know if anybody does. So that's the best I can say.
Can I kind of ask a question, just as an extension of what Yash asked?
Go ahead, Krishna.
Hello. Yeah. When we talk about fitness and we talk about evolution, much of what we are talking about is on the physical realm. With respect to evolution of the intellect, what are the theories?
No, I mean, I don't know. I really don't know. But when you're talking about, see, the only thing that matters intellectually, you could be as well. First of all, I don't know what intellectual evolution means. But you could be as evolved as you like in an intellectual capacity, but if you do not leave offsprings behind, you're at evolutionary dead end, right? So fitness has to be measured in the context of offsprings and not sort of the more mental evolution that you seem to be
No,
referring to.
I'm not referring to you at the expense of physical. I'm talking as we evolve physically.
Yeah.
What are the drivers for intellectual evolution?
No, so I am not 100% sure, but there is a lot of things that we do know about evolution of brain size and stuff like that. One of the very curious things that has come out some years back now is that there is a point mutation. There is a single mutation, and this is what people think happened. There's a single mutation which basically made our jaws connection to our skull a lot looser than what it is found in chimpanzees, for instance. And what this looseness basically meant is that our skulls could expand and accommodate the growing brain size. So, I mean, you could have effects as small as that, which could lead to these profound changes that have taken place over evolutionary time.
As an extension, something, I'm going to take a kind of, walk on thin ice kind of question. Much of the evolution we talk about is somehow related to changes in the DNA, whether it is at the germ level or whether it is epigenetic. Do you foresee that as we evolve, we might evolve to the point that we will go away from DNA as a genetic material?
No, I don't. No, at least not in my imagination. No, I don't see that scenario. That doesn't mean it's impossible, but I actually don't even know what that means. But
yeah,
no.
People have been talking about silicon-based life rather than carbon-based life.
No, I mean, I know, but I'm not suggesting that anything other than carbon-based life could exist. It could, but what I do not foresee is us evolving into anything other than what we are, because it has taken billions of years of evolution to shape us into the complex beings that we are, and by we I mean all creation. And now for this system to move to another completely another model of life would require serious deleterious changes that would occur in existing beings, and natural selection will not permit that to happen.
Thank you very much for your insights.
Sir?
Yeah.
Yeah, hi. This is Ketki. So the next question is, what is Darwinism and what is its relevance in 21st century?
You mean biologically?
Yeah.
This, well, Darwinism is essentially that we read passages of Wallace and Darwin, and both seem to suggest that that even if the variations were to provide you an infinitely small advantage over your competitor, if you allowed that advantage to prevail over a long enough time, you would outcompete the competitor. And there is a thought that natural selection acting on as minute a change as that should be able to explain what has happened to life, what has happened to the diversity of life that we have on the planet. That action of selection is able to explain evolution of life. That's essentially Darwinism, that natural selection explains everything. The other idea, the other very popular idea in evolution is that natural selection plays a rather limited role in bringing about diversity of life. Many evolutionary changes are random in nature. Okay, so a change would happen and it doesn't really cause a huge advantage. It doesn't really cause a huge disadvantage to the individual, but you have variation that has entered the population. Selection is not very effective in this sense, in this sense of the understanding of the evolutionary process, in either removing competition or weeding out variants that exist in the population. So one might argue, but at the other hand, Darwinism means that selection explains everything. And the other end is this thing that selection does play a role, no question about that. But a large degree of biological variation can be explained by just randomness, and evolution is statistically a random process. So there is tension between the extent to which selection decides evolutionary processes and to the extent where selection and randomness decide evolutionary process. There is a very famous article published around 1980 by Levontin and Gould, which sort of touch on this idea. And very recently, there was another article published, which was on 30 years of completion of that idea, which is essentially Darwinism versus this thought, this idea that it's also random. Evolution is basically whatever works.
Hi, sir. My name is Yash, and I'm having one question.
Go ahead,
can
Yash.
Can I ask, sir?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sir. My question is that is evolution in play, like during the final ages of life, like in the old age? Is evolution still into play?
One would argue that when you're old, you're sort of irrelevant as far as evolution is concerned, because evolution is a process that takes place generation through generation. And if you're not going to have offsprings, if nobody over 60 or 70 has offsprings, you're sort of not relevant. But there is interesting work. I mean, suppose all human beings decided, this is obviously a hypothetical scenario. Suppose all human beings decided to have children only after the age of 40. Okay, then obviously that's sort of not a good exercise as per current expectations. But then what we are selecting for is genes which are going to lead to healthy babies who are given birth to by women over 40, right? And so on and so forth. So you can sort of select for alleles which are going to push a change like that. And you can have sort of plays like this, but aging is an area, I mean, a lot of work goes into that, but I'm not really aware of how that impacts the evolution of us as a species.
So, related to the same question, I am having one more question related to this. So, what if, keeping in view the current lifestyle and the growth of healthcare industries, if the average span of a human being is like added up or expanded by 10 or maybe 5 years more, like right now it is 70 or 65. So if it is increased like average, it is increased to like 90 or even 100. So will the evolution be affected because of it?
Well, I don't, assuming that the individual is not going to be reproductively active between the ages of 70 and 90, I don't think the implication on evolutionary change is going to be direct. It could have other implications, though, that, I mean, having a large population to support, which is between the age of 70 and 90, is going to have social, economic, political, cultural implications, which then shape, our lifestyle decisions and the choices that we make. So I don't think that scenario is going to lead to a direct evolutionary change, but it's all connected.
So one more question. If now this is not related to age, but it is related to treatment that gene therapy, or maybe inducing controlled region cells in human population, like a treatment or a therapy. So if we used this kind of therapies, like regenerative therapies, stem cell therapies, gene therapy, uh, will this new therapy affect the evolution, and how so? Like, I wanted to have your view on it.
I don't see how the two are connected, but I don't feel I mean, I don't feel comfortable enough to give you an answer on that. I don't know enough about that.
Okay, sir. Thank you so much.
Dr. Supreet, Krishna again.
Yeah.
Thank you for answering. Our kids are very intelligent. Huh? So I said something while teaching anti-cancer agents as to why we get cancer, why we have not evolved to kind of avoid cancer, and they asked the same question to you in a very different manner about the evolution with respect. And I kind of told them the same thing, that there is no need for you to be there as soon as your biological function is over.
Yeah.
Okay, from nature's perspective.
Right.
Can I throw in another little wrench? People, I always hear about this. One is the theory of evolution versus the second, the theory of creation.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes they are at loggerheads to each other in a sense.
Right.
And when people say that we never evolved, we were just placed here by whoever or whatever.
Right.
What are your views on that?
Well, I feel that whoever proposes either of the two views, that we evolved from a common ancestor. I mean, one of the natural implications of life being arranged in a tree structure is that if it is a branching tree, then the branching tree must have a root, and that root is called LUCA, which is last universal common ancestor. Like chimps and us, we have an ancestor 5 million years ago. Us and cows have an ancestor 100 million years ago, and so on and so forth. So if we go far back enough, then every life form must have a common ancestor from which life originated, and that common ancestor is called LUCA, last universal common ancestor. And it's thought that LUCA first came into being around 3.8 billion years ago, which is a surprisingly short time after the planet was formed. So if you are a proponent of a thought like this, the onus is on you to come up with a scientific explanation of how that could have materialized, and LUCA coming into existence, how could life have come to a state such as what we see currently. And as far as I know, that every step of the way, there are literally thousands of people working to address those issues. And one of the most fascinating experiments that is going on is about the origin of LUCA, where we now think that, I mean, the current thought is that LUCA came into being what are called alkaline hydrothermal vents on the bed of the ocean. Very specific chemistry and certain geological conditions make formation of cells as a thermodynamically favorable process in those environmental conditions. And this is work that has only been done in the last 10 years or so. So really cool experiments going along all the way from arrival of Luca to arrival of new species today. People are working really cool. I mean, one of the another major events that has happened is that an archaea engulfing a bacteria, and that bacteria evolving into mitochondria, and so on and so forth, that leading to evolution of a eukaryotic organism and life progressing from there on. Again, lots of work is being done in that direction. So the burden on proof in this case is on people like me, and there are lots of people who are working towards arriving answers at that. However, on the other side of the coin, when we invoke creationism, the burden of proof is also on creationists. And as far as I know, I don't see any effort to, provide any substantial backing explaining how creationism worked.
Point well taken, sir. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, we have a few questions from the audience as well. As you can just unmute and ask your questions. If you have time, sir, I know it's just late now.
I'm happy to stay for 10 more minutes. Maybe we can wrap up at 6:30.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much.
No problem.
Sir, I had a question.
Yeah, please go ahead, Arshil.
I had a question that in the Darwinism theory, when Darwin was studying the evolutionary aspect of the species, he was also looking at the work of a person named Thomas Malthus, and his study was on population. So that aspect is known as Malthusianism. So in that particular aspect of his study, he came up with the some kind of prophecy that there will be a day when the amount of resources on the earth will be not enough to manage the entire population of this human population on this planet. So do you think that will lead to some another kind of extinction, like a level of mass extinction? As I want to know your view on that.
Mass extinctions have shaped evolutionary history of life all along the way. The biggest mass extinction event that the Earth has seen is called the Permian extinction event. And that extinction event basically wiped out, some estimates say 98% of all species that are surviving on Earth, that at that time survived on the Earth. And basically that event created room for eventual evolution of dinosaurs who came to sort of dominate the Earth for millions of years. And that era was sort of ended by another extinction event, which is called KT extinction event, which happened 65 million years ago, when something rammed into Earth in the peninsula. And this event led to extinction of dinosaurs and provided sort of the breeding ground for mammals to come up. I don't know. I mean, I think mass extinctions are these catastrophic events where you see a very sharp decrease in the number of species existing in a fairly short amount of time. And I feel we are ourselves causing a sort of a mini extinction event. And it would be curious to see how much damage we do before things take a corrective action. I mean, it's happening at a smaller scale even now. You see reports of flood where you've not heard of floods, forest fires going on all around. So it's happening at a small scale. I don't think it is going to have a catastrophic event of the magnitude of Permian extinction or KT extinction. But how much damage it would take for us to sort of take reversals on our actions or be more mindful of nature? That's a more political question rather than a scientific question. I don't know that, but I think nature is pretty resilient. It has its way. I don't think human beings possess enough arsenal to sort of wipe out life other than ourselves. So I mean, I don't know, but eventually, one certainty for every species is that it goes extinct, and species don't usually last for more than a few million years. So once you have arrived at a species, the only certainty is that the species is going to go extinct. I don't think we should be too worried about that.
Thank you, sir, for your answer.
We have a question from Naman, I guess.
Yeah. Hi. Am I on?
Yeah, you
I
are.
can hear you.
Okay. Hello, sir. So my question was, we know that the life evolved much later after the formation of Earth, and there is also something known as chemical evolution, which was much before a proper, which we know as the prokaryotic or the eukaryotic cell, which was there, it was there before the cell was formed, and there was a proper genetic material. So how do we understand evolution in the sense of a non-cellular organization, that is a not proper cellular organization, in terms of not a proper genetic material or a proper cell structure that could convey information from one generation to other?
Yeah, I mean that's what I said, that that is an area that in the last 10-15 years has sort of been revolutionized since late 90s with the discovery of these alkaline hydrothermal vents. So if you think about it, what is it that we need to make a cell? If there was no cell, what all components would you need for the arrival of the first cell? And if I were to sort of quickly take a few guesses, a few items that I would need to make a cell would be a material of heredity, energy, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen sources, enzymes for catalysis. Right? I mean, not necessarily enzymes, but I would need catalysts for sure. Source of energy I already mentioned. So these are the primary needs, and some sort of compartmentalization, which would act as membranes, because a cell by definition is what is inside and what is outside. So we need that demarcation also to take place. And obviously all of this is not going to take place in one step. It's going to be multiple steps. And there's actually been a lot of work which has been done in understanding the chemistry which would lead to formation of precursors, which would then lead to biomolecules, biologically relevant molecules come into being. We also have a fair degree of estimation of what were these membranes before actually cellular membranes came into being. You're talking of essentially just a chemical soup, but still you need some sort of demarcation between the environment and itself. So there is quite a bit of things known about that. There are some things which we do not know anything about, like how did the genetic code come into being and this, that. But I think it's early days, and it's quite fascinating to see people working on it. And I'm pretty curious as to see what happens in those efforts being made to understand that first process. But there is a surprising degree of detail that is known about the processes that you're talking about.
Yes, sir. A very vague hypothesis that I made was that it could be a chain reaction, or a reaction that could be a product of one reaction could be used as a substrate for other reaction going on in vicinity inside that hot soup could have led to the formation of a system.
Yeah, no. I mean, I think there are these condensation reactions, polymerization reactions, which sort of propose what you do. But essentially, the main challenge is that you can't have evolution of a cell take place in an ocean where sort of reactants are free to float away or diffuse away. You need for these entities to come together and form biologically relevant molecules. You need them confined in a small space where there is presence of energy, where there is presence of catalysts, organic or inorganic. Some of these things need to be supplied. And it's identifying that particular niche which satisfies all these criteria. And it is in this context that these alkaline hydrothermal vents are being looked at as a very promising candidate where it could have happened.
Absolutely. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, sir. I would just,
Can I
Yes, sir,
close
yes,
with
sir.
one question to sir? I think it's just fascinating. If I was there, I would keep on asking till 9 o'clock or something like that. But we need to let him go. I just need his viewpoint. What or who, according to you, is probably the fittest as of today on Earth?
I don't know what you mean, like the name of a human being who's the fittest?
No, across everything which we classify as having the ability to evolve in the conditions which are reigning on the Earth. Who or what do you think has done it the best over the years? And maybe continue to do so.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because we know that prokaryotes have existed for 3.7, 3.8, depending on which reference, which study. 3.7 billion years prokaryotes have existed. However, one of the things that has not happened with prokaryotes is morphological complexity. That prokaryotes exist in single cells, and of course they form swarms and stuff, but those are relatively minor. You don't see a tree coming from assortment of prokaryotic cells, whereas eukaryotic cells have only been around for a little over 2 billion years. But I am a product of when eukaryotes first evolved, it was a single eukaryotic cell. But from there, multicellularity evolved. Eukaryotic cells learned to live together. All of the complexities that my body contains has arrived from eukaryotic cells learning to compartmentalize, learning to live together, cooperate, hold back their growth rate so that I survive. All of that has happened because eukaryotic cells learned to do. Prokaryotic cells didn't learn to do, hence you don't see human beings coming from prokaryotes, although they have been around for much longer. So in terms of morphological complexity, bacteria, archaea don't do as well. But I think there is no question that bacteria and viruses, they are the fittest. I don't think they will get wiped.
Thank you.
Well, they also say, that among more complex organisms, should a catastrophe hit the Earth, cockroaches would do very well. Hard to get rid of them. Rats would do well as well. So I think these would be my guesses for the fittest creatures around.
Thank you, sir. Thank you,
No
sir.
problem.
Wonderful hearing.
So just 2 minutes work. I know it's very late, so I would request Soham to give a formal vote of thanks and quickly requesting everyone to turn on the camera so that we could just have a look meanwhile. Yes, Soham, please go ahead.
Hi, so good evening, everybody. I'm Soham More, the secretary for this chapter, and I'll be giving the thanks today. I would like to thank our speaker for today, Dr. Supreet Saini, Professor of Chemical Engineering at IIT Bombay. Dr. Saini, thank you for your insights, and also personally, it was really informative to know more about the process and the whole story about the creation of the theories. And thank you for taking time off of your busy schedule for this talk today. I would now like to thank our faculty advisor, Dr. Krishna Iyer, who was very enthusiastic with his questions today, and our faculty co-advisors, Dr. Sagar Patel and Dr. Elvis Martis, and the whole team for organizing and managing this webinar. I would like to thank all the students and the faculty members for attending this event and engaging in it. Now, before leaving this meeting, I would like to request all of you to please fill the feedback form, the link of which has already been put in the chat box. And thank you and have a great day.
Well, thanks for having me. And yeah, this was fun. Okay, so bye, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Supreet.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, sir. Yeah. Thank you all.
Thank you, sir.